The rush of battle is a often potent and lethal addiction, for war is a drug. This is the quote that begins Kathryn Bigelow's The Hurt Locker, and I must say, it is pretty nice to have the director lay out the message of the film in the first 5 seconds. It makes my job pretty easy. So, war is an adrenaline rush that soldiers become addicted to. That's it, guys. Thank you so much for stopping by. Remember to subscribe on your way out. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Well, not quite. The Hurt Locker and its main character, Sergeant James, are a bit more complex than the quote that begins the film. Now, whenever you discuss the Hurt Locker, it is worth prefacing the discussion by pointing out that the film is riddled with inaccuracies. James and his men drive around Iraq alone. Sanborn punches James, which would get him Article 15. I could go on, and for a film attempting to bring the audience into the conflict, they probably should have put more effort into realism. With that said, a story is a story, and I can suspend my disbelief if I think the story has something interesting to say, which I think the Hurt Locker does. Of course, if you served in Iraq, I can understand if you're unable to suspend your disbelief and enjoy the story, and that seems to be the general sentiment. Now, getting into the film itself, there are many questions worth asking about the Hurt Locker. For one, what makes James who he is? Did the war create James, or did the adrenaline-infused nature of being an EOD attract him? In other words, was it nature or nurture, or both? But what I think is the most interesting question is the one I'm going to try to answer here. Is adrenaline the only thing keeping James at war? Is he just a junkie that needs his fix, or is there something deeper at work? The answer to that question is not only relevant to Bigelow's story, but to the human experience in general, especially the modern world. So relax, settle back, and let's explore this unique and at times strange film created by the superb Kathryn Bigelow. The film begins by trying to establish what it's like to be an EOD and what it's like to be in Iraq in general. You need to be aware of your surroundings at all times. Things that may seem innocuous at first could lead to your demise. It is high stress 24/7, and the constant awareness needed to survive is certainly part of the reason Sergeant James loves the job. Although Thompson, who's portrayed by Guy Pearce, jokes around on the job, he does follow the general procedure. After getting a tip on an IED, they send out their little robot, and I half expected Anthony Mackie to call it Red Wing while I watched the film again, and they also break out a little cart to move the debts, which loses a wheel and forces Thompson to move the charges himself. So the procedure slows them down a little bit, and then when the triggerman appears, Eldridge does not take the shot, and Thompson is killed. And his death from an aesthetic perspective is now one of the most famous of the 21st century. The Hurt Locker was filmed almost entirely with handheld cameras to create that documentary look, but Bigelow mixes it in with these extremely refined moments. The cinematographer compared this decision to a sculptor using bronze for one piece and marble for another, and I think that's a great way to describe it. So in the first 10 minutes, we understand the world we're in. 1 second the job was done and Thompson was headed back, in the next second he's dead. In a world this dangerous, Sanborn and Eldridge want a man like Thompson who's predictable and seems to take things seriously. But they end up with Sergeant Will James, who I think is one of the best war movie characters of all time. I've noticed that with great movie characters, you get a general gauge of them within the first 30 seconds, and the same holds true for James. When Sanborn first meets his new leader, James asks for his help taking the boarding off his windows, and Sanborn warns him that the boarding is there to protect him from mortar fire at night, but James just says, yeah, well, I like the sunshine. Very small moment, but it foreshadows who this man is, and I really like when writers introduce characters like that. When the three men go out on their first mission, James does a couple of things that really piss off Sanborn. For one, he doesn't follow procedure, he opts against the robot, he doesn't give constant updates on his movements, but even more than that, he doesn't appear to be taking things seriously. He laughs to himself as he starts walking towards the bomb, and remember, Thompson has just died, so Sanborn is more than justified in his annoyance. But despite James's reckless methods, he gets the job done, as he has for hundreds of other missions. And my favorite part of the scene is when James shows the bomb part to the triggerman. It emphasizes how James sees himself in competition with the enemy, and I get the sense that the adrenaline was nothing compared to the satisfaction he got in that moment. Now, when Sanborn approaches James about his methods, James says something very, very interesting. Sanborn says yesterday wasn't cool, and James responds with, yeah, but you'll get it though. You'll get it. What does that even mean? What is it that Sanborn doesn't get? Well, I thought about it a lot, and I'm going to give you my theory here, which I'm very proud of, by the way, so don't go too tough on me in the comment section. So this is my theory, and I'm not saying this would be clever in reality, I'm just trying to understand what James could mean here. So there's a lesson in the art of war, which is attack him where he is unprepared, and appear where you are not expected. If insurgents have been watching how EODs operate for years, it stands to reason that their strategies are designed to counter what they have observed. James breaks those expectations. He acts quickly and recklessly. He is more than willing to go against the normal procedure to get the job done, and get an adrenaline rush in the process. So the reckless nature of how James operates is intrinsic to his success because the enemy is just not accustomed to it. That's my theory. The other possibility is he's referring to the adrenaline rush he gets, but that seems a little odd in the circumstance. Given the fact that the little cart made by the army breaks down at the beginning of the film and gets Thompson killed, I don't think I'm stretching too far. During this time of growing dysfunction between the unit, we learn that James has defused 873 bombs. He knows the exact number, which says a lot about him as well. Defusing bombs is like a sport to him, and he takes great pride in what he has achieved. And this is where I want to start discussing the question I mentioned at the beginning. Is this man just an adrenaline junkie? Well, the first half of the film would suggest as much, but the second half complicates things significantly, and the turning point is the sniper scene. The scene occurs right after Sanborn considers killing James, so it's at the height of their problems. And by this point, we have not seen James react to a situation where men are being killed around him, and Sanborn's perception of James would predict him to act selfishly and perhaps create dysfunction, but the opposite happens. James ends up being the calming hand of the entire disaster. He knows Sanborn hates his guts, but he does everything possible to ensure his success. He even makes sure he stays hydrated. But his moments with Eldridge are the most surprising. He knows Eldridge is not made for situations like this, but he keeps him steady, and their moments together are actually quite touching.
You're doing good, man. You're doing real good. Got him? Hey, I'm gonna keep you safe, buddy, all right? Now let's get these bastards. Scan your sectors.
If it wasn't for James's calming presence, Eldridge probably doesn't pull the trigger later in the scene. So here's my view of Sergeant Will James. The adrenaline is secondary to him. James has defused over 800 bombs. He no doubt still gets an adrenaline rush, but it's impossible for it to be as potent as it once was. What he really is in love with is a feeling of being useful and necessary in an extremely important and meaningful occupation. I can never resist a Breaking Bad comparison, so I'm just going to go for it here. His mindset is comparable to when Walter White says the following to his wife, Skylar.
Do you know what would happen if I suddenly decided to stop going into work? A business big enough that it could be listed on the NASDAQ goes belly up. Disappears. It ceases to exist without me. No, you click.
What would happen if James, probably the best EOD there is, stopped doing his job? How many people would die? Quite a few, I would imagine. And when he tells his wife about the massive bombing towards the end of the film, I think in his mind, he believes his presence would prevent similar attacks. James is the type of man who tries to save everyone. When he finds the dead boy who is going to be used as a body bomb, he starts to crack. He thinks it's Beckham, the boy who hangs out at the base, which it isn't, and his decaying mental state is probably responsible for his confusion. He immediately wants to take revenge, and I don't think that's him just thirsting for adrenaline. He takes it personally when he sees innocents he didn't have the power to save. And curiously, he calls his wife right after getting back to the base, which is odd given how he behaves towards her later in the film. I suspect he wants to make sure that the two people he cares about back home, and I do think he cares about them, are at the very least safe and sound. Now, during the revenge mission itself, he realizes that he's gone off the deep end a little bit. He heads back to the base, but instead of getting a night to mentally recover, he's forced back into the field by the massive explosion of a tanker truck. It's a horrifying yet gorgeous scene. Some of the shots are jaw-dropping, and James is still locked into revenge mode at this point. The dead bodies all around him only exasperate that desire. He leads Sanborn and Eldridge into an extremely risky mission to hunt down the Trigger Man, and predictably, their mission is a disaster, and Eldridge is almost killed. The scene is the culmination of everything James has seen. He's done a lot of good, he saved hundreds of lives, but there are hundreds he couldn't save. And when he steps into the shower and the blood washes off of him, it's almost like all of the filth he's witnessed is coming off. He hides his pain very well throughout the movie, but when he's alone and finally needs some release, we get to see what's mixed in with the dirt and sweat. The last few scenes of the Hurt Locker are astounding. Once James and Sanborn get back in the field, we for the first time watch James fail to defuse a bomb. For as good as Sergeant James is, he just can't save him in time. He just can't get all the locks off. And Ryder does an incredible job showing his despair of not being able to save this good man.
Any locks? There's too many. I can't do it. I can't get it off. I'm sorry, okay? You understand? I'm sorry. You hear me? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Get down now!
James and Sanborn barely escape with their lives, and when James is thrown to the ground, he sees a kite in the sky. It's a beautiful image, and the writer mentioned that it could also be insurgents communicating, so it serves to show the duality of beauty and terror, and that duality is a constant theme in famous war films. Perhaps the greatest scene of The Hurt Locker is the monologue given by Sanborn as he and James drive away from the explosion scene. It's some of the best dialogue I've heard in a 21st century film.
I want a little boy, Will.
Sanborn tells Will that he wants to go home and become a father, and he just can't understand how James can walk confidently into the storm, knowing his life is hanging on a thread at every moment. And James has a son back home he could enjoy. James does not give Sanborn an answer on why he is who he is, and perhaps he doesn't even know. But I think an answer could be found from one of the great writers of the 20th century. George Orwell wrote something incredibly powerful in his review of Hitler's Mein Kampf. In the review, Orwell is trying to explain why so many Germans gave themselves up to such a destructive ideology. He writes, "Human beings don't only want comfort, safety, short working hours, hygiene, birth control, and in general common sense. They also, at least intermittently, want struggle and self-sacrifice." The consumer lifestyle of the average American just doesn't do it for James. Is it more comfortable? Yes. Is it safer? Of course. And on its face, is it a more appealing lifestyle? I would say so. I'm sure most people would also agree. But the pursuit of comfort is not all that life is about. And I think our modern society, especially our politicians, have a serious problem understanding this truth. Another element worth noting is how James does not have anyone in his life who can understand his experiences. If you look at ancient history, almost every man at some point went to war. And when those wars concluded, or paused, every day they could talk to someone who saw the brutality of existence. James is isolated. He's isolated in an environment where he doesn't feel useful or valuable. In fact, his ex-wife basically has to guide his life as a civilian. You can view James's departure at the end of the film as him forfeiting responsibility or a display of his addiction to war, and I would concede that the comparatively mundane life at home is jarring for James, but I see it more as a display of what Orwell is talking about. James chooses to return to a place of struggle and self-sacrifice, a place where he feels he has utility, and the more I think about it, the more difficult it is for me to judge that decision. Alright, that is The Hurt Locker, directed by Kathryn Bigelow. If you enjoyed this video, remember to like and subscribe on your way out. I also have a playlist on screen with a few more war movie videos you may enjoy. Thank you so much for stopping by. Have a fantastic rest of your day. I'll talk to you soon.